Now the COP26 is over, we're doing postmortems on it. What issues were addressed, which ones weren't, and where exactly does Canada stand in all of this? So I'm going to talk to Professor David Wright, Faculty of Law at the University of Calgary, who's written a couple of blog posts dissecting what went on at COP26. So welcome to the interview, David.
Thanks for having me, Markham.
Look, let's go through your two blog posts and the various issues. And let's start with the first day of COP26. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau announced a cap on oil and gas emissions. And boy, I bet that resonated in Alberta.
It certainly made headlines, Markham, although it wasn't much of a surprise because it was in the Liberal campaign platform in the fall federal election. So it wasn't entirely surprising, and one would have reasonably expected it to be on show and showcased at COP26 in Glasgow. So no surprise there, although it's a significant new announcement in that a cap on oil and gas does not exist at the federal level in Canada right now. Of course, Alberta does have a legislated cap for oil sands specifically, but this is a new measure en route to net zero emissions in 2050.
Right. Now, just to be clear, the current one is 100 megaton oil sands emissions cap, and the industry is currently at 70 megatons. So it's a cap you can grow into. That's not what the Prime Minister was talking about. He's going to cap it where it is emissions are now, and then expect the industry to bring emissions down on a regular basis, right?
Well, that's a reasonable interpretation. I mean, in short, there are many devilish details to be unpacked here, and really no one has the answer. What happened in this case is the announcement was made and a letter was sent jointly from the Minister of Environment and Climate Change and the Minister of Natural Resources to the Net Zero Advisory Body, kind of saying, hey, can you help us sort out how to implement this commitment? And so, yes, to the extent that there is room to grow under the existing Alberta cap, that seems like a slightly different model than what's envisioned in this federal regime, although keep in mind, it sounds like it's going to be a national approach. So it may be that some jurisdictions or sectors or actors are allowed to grow a little bit before then contracting toward 2050.
And you make the point in your post that the federal government has ample, I think is the word you use, constitutional authority to do this.
Yeah, and so that word is actually from a wonderful comprehensive analysis by Natalie Chalifour at a law professor at University of Ottawa, and there have been others who have made such analyses. And of course, we have the recent Supreme Court of Canada reference case opinion on the Greenhouse Gas Pollution Pricing Act. But in short, the federal government has several bases of constitutional authority through which they can act to take this kind of regulatory step. The most likely pathway here is under the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, which provides the authority to put in place regulations of this type. And so those would emulate in some degrees in terms of sort of statutory or regulatory design, those in place for tailpipe emissions, those in place for coal-fired electricity power plant emissions, and those in place for methane already. So the DNA, if you will, the legal DNA and pathways already there, likely that's the most likely form this will take.
Let's talk about ending fossil fuel subsidies. And this is on my radar because I've reported quite a bit about the oil sands net zero by 2050 pathways initiative, where it's going to cost $75 billion. The companies have said they're going to ask governments for $50 billion. Now, if that is that a fossil fuel subsidy, or would it not be one?
Well, that's the many million, if not billion-dollar question, really. So a common theme across most everything we're going to talk about here, Markham, is stay tuned, and many devilish details are to be worked out. When it comes to the fossil fuel subsidies, that's been on the table for many years, and there's an existing commitment from the G7, another one from the G20. And part of the issue has been defining what constitutes a subsidy and what does not. So does it include royalty rates, for example? Does it include tax relief, for example? And when does a subsidy for fossil fuels actually become a subsidy for clean energy, but it's going to a fossil fuel company? So again, many methodological devilish details to be worked out on that front. But overall, for those who are interested in reaching climate change commitments and emission reduction targets, this is certainly a step in the right direction. I guess I would just say for those interested, and there's a link in my blog to this, the Federal Environment Commissioner had a very accessible plain language report on this that came out in 2018 or 19. It's a good one-stop shop for the anatomy of the issue.
Right. Now, I should make the point that I'll put the link to your two blog posts in the YouTube description, so anybody can have a look at them. Well, let's talk about methane. Now, this has been on the table for a while. The federal government, I think it was 2017, 2018, committed to 40 to 45% reduction. No, it might even have been earlier than that, 2015 in the Climate Leadership Plan in Alberta. But now we're up to 75%. Is that the number we're talking about here?
Yeah, so there's kind of two things going on here. And one is illustrative of kind of broader happenings at COP26. So on all the issues we've talked about so far, Canada sort of teamed up with like-minded countries, like-minded parties to the Climate Change Framework Convention, and made these announcements. In Canada's case, many of these were re-announcing existing measures, policies, tools, and regulatory efforts, and so on. So this would be one of those, although the update here is this commitment to, in the Canadian context, to reducing methane emissions by at least 75% below 2021 levels by 2030. And so a regulatory regime is already in place. So the specific bit to stay tuned to is what this means in terms of ratcheting down those regulations at the formal regulatory level. And all of that goes beyond what was committed to in this global methane pledge that was part of the big announcement from Canada and some 40 or so other nations at COP26.
Let's talk about the, as you put it, reincarnated US-China bilateral pact. Are there any implications for Canada in this pact?
Well, first of all, it is a couple things. So it's a reincarnation of the bilateral U.S.-China agreement, pact, declaration, whatever you want to call it, fairly loose political agreement that existed under the Obama administration. It was created in 2014. Although this latest reincarnation, and that was done in the lead up to the Paris Agreement and was critical in demonstrating to the world that the world's two largest emitters are ready to play ball within the UN Framework Convention regime. That didn't happen in the lead up to COP26. Not totally clear why. We know that China and US have their own differences, so it might have been hard to get the dialogue going. Biden was only, came to be president some 9 months ago, and so on. But it's a major move, even if it covers a little less ground than its predecessor. For Canada, of course, Canada's not named in it, but what this tells Canada is, first of all, the largest trading partner in the form of the United States is on board and heading in this direction, and that another large trading partner in the form of China is also, playing ball within the Paris Agreement paradigm, and that Canada is not kind of going it alone when it puts in place the type of measures that it's putting in place to address climate change. I guess the other signal is that, and this is what's in the blog, is even though political winds change, and the Biden administration right now is providing tailwinds essentially for Canada in its approach to climate change, and the United States seems willing to use its international clout, including on a trade front, to push for climate action world over.
Let's talk about loss and damage, and this will be on Canadians' minds because of the devastating BC floods just a few days ago. So the issue here is smaller nations that need to adapt to climate change and are asking for financial support from the developed countries. Have I got that right?
Yeah, you've got that right, Markham. There's three main pillars of the international regime that are relevant here. So one is mitigation, i.e. Cutting greenhouse gas emissions largely through clean energy approaches. Then there's adaptation, so all countries working to adapt to climate change impacts. None of these are mutually exclusive. There's a third and thorny, long-standing kind of desired pillar, which is loss and damage. And that has been pushed hard by the countries most vulnerable to climate change impacts for literally decades. And there was hope, especially in those corners, that at COP26, there would be a new formal mechanism put in place to start providing funds to these nations who are experiencing the worst of the climate impacts. So that would not include Canada, notwithstanding what's going on in British Columbia right now. That would rather be focused on countries like Vanuatu, the Maldives, so especially these low-lying small island states, as well as least developed countries like, say, Bangladesh. Ultimately, nothing came out of COP on that specific front. There was some sort of window dressing and tinkering at the margins in terms of technical assistance for those countries to deal with loss and damage. But this thorny issue of providing funds to these countries who are experiencing climate change damages essentially remains unresolved. And that's separate and apart from any discussion of potential legal liability of large emitters for these damages. The conversation is not there, has never been there, and there's great reluctance, as you might imagine, on developed countries to engage in discussion that uses the word responsibility and liability. Loss and damages are kind of euphemisms in that context.
Understood. Let's talk about Article 6. This is a bit convoluted, and so I'm going to let you maybe start with an explanation of what Article 6 is.
Sure. So Article 6 of the Paris Agreement is the latest incarnation of use of market mechanisms and cooperation between nations using market forces, if you will, to achieve low-cost greenhouse gas emission reductions. And so where, for example, the Kyoto Protocol had several mechanisms at the time called the Clean Development Mechanism, which allowed for a developed country to fund a clean energy project in a developing country and then enjoy those credits toward their Kyoto target. Another one similar but slightly different was joint implementation. Article 6 is what brings that to life in the new regime. And you're right, it is complicated, it's technical, and I know a number of us are still digesting and parsing what exactly was agreed to. But the short version is there is now in place a rule book under Article 6 that will allow these market mechanisms to be created, allow both public governments and private entities to take steps that generate emission reduction credits and then to trade them in one form or another. Key issue in that mix is what kind of environmental and human rights safeguards are alive. We can chat about that if you like, but those did get brought into the final text.
Actually, there's an Alberta angle here because the Alberta Premier Jason Kenney and the Alberta-based oil and gas industry has pointed to Article 6 and what they're hoping for is that they'll be able to sell clean LNG to places like China, where it will supposedly displace coal in power generation, but then they're going to sell it as a commercial product, make money on it, but then also turn around and get these credits back. And so it's basically double counting. And that was a big debate at COP26, I understand.
Yeah, so that's for all intents and purposes off the table now. That specific methodology, that specific sort of sequence of logic is not explicitly in the new rule book, but it's unlikely that application of the rule book to that kind of factual scenario in that sector will result in emission reduction credits that can be traded internationally. So one way to think about it is that the rules are there, the methodology is there, and it tells us when something becomes a credit and constitutes a credit, and that likely will not constitute a credit in this context. Most people would say that any emission reduction advantages of liquefied natural gas being imported and burned in those countries is already built into the price, priced into that product, that commodity price. But then, of course, that those emission reductions would be enjoyed by the country that purchases that product and reduces their emissions accordingly. So that's quite a stretch, and I think that line of logic is likely to fade into the background at this time.
Sure. Let's wrap up with a quick discussion of finance, because of course we had Canadian Mark Carney leading the Glasgow Alliance of financial investors and the banking community. Tell us about that.
Well, so financial assistance from developed countries to developing countries is, again, a major part of the international climate change framework, recognizing that developed countries have enjoyed the benefit of emissions for many years and are better resourced, especially per capita GDP and so on, to provide financial assistance to developing countries, especially least developing countries. And so less of this finance would go to the so-called emerging countries and so on. But it's been a longstanding issue because developed countries for many years have fallen short. So similar to emission reduction targets, countries will pledge a certain amount of dollars to be provided in financial assistance, but then not hit that. And so in this context, $100 billion was pledged to flow every year starting in 2020. And that was pledged during the Paris Agreement negotiations in 2015. Ultimately, developed countries fell short of that, somewhere in the neighborhood of 80 billion. So that eroded trust in this specific area of the international regime. But the deal that was struck in the Glasgow Climate Pact reiterates that commitment, recognizes that shortfall, and essentially sets the stage for that target to be hit till 2025. But COP26 did not produce a clear outcome for what financial assistance would look like post 2025. So that's one of a number of things that will be on the docket for COP27 in Egypt next year. The two big ones really are financial assistance post 2025 and loss and damage, because that was unresolved. Those are two of the biggest to stay tuned on.
No, David, thank you very much for this. I now understand COP26 much better than I did before we started the interview. Thank you very much for your insights.
Great to hear. Thanks for having me, Markham. Take care.